Thanks for checking out the Brad and John Show podcast. This segment of the show is brought to you by John Combest's book, Stalking, Harassment, Internet Trolling, A Guide to Recovering and Rebuilding After Online Attacks. It's a great reference if you've ever been the unfortunate target of a social media attack. It's available on Amazon. Just search John Combest. That's C-O-M-B-E-S-T, John Combest, and the book will show up in your search results. Now it's time for another segment of the Brad and John Show. Can you handle it?
It's me, Egbert, once again. I'm the new owner of this station. I went out and hired the best talk radio consultant, Jeff Allen from News Talk STL, and told him to hire the worst talent he could find. Jeff did exactly as I told him. Ladies and gentlemen, here are Brad and John.
I still don't know how to take that, John. Is that a compliment or is that a diss?
It's always, you know what I always say, Brad, and I wrote this in the Missouri Times last year, which you can find at MissouriTimes.com. Always assume positive intent. Yeah. So if somebody comes up to you and says, boy, Brad, your radio show with John sure is different. If we're overly defensive, we're going to be like, oh, different? What do you mean different? We don't have people coming on reading the same 3 talking points, huh? You want us to be like them? Or you could take it as a compliment and assume positive intent.
So are you telling me that Brian Richardson and Chris Tickhouse, when they tried to get me kicked out of the O'Fallon Chamber of Commerce, were really trying to compliment me? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
They absolutely were. And what a public service you provided me by telling me names of 2 people I had never heard of before.
Yeah, well, you don't want to know anyway. That's a whole other story. Okay, something which has been on the back burner because John sent this to me, and I put it on my show list from day to day, and you and I get sidetracked, just like last break we got sidetracked. John, I mentioned this story last week. I think it was last week, maybe the week before. I think it was last week. I told the story of me going to a wrestling event, a professional wrestling event at a high school. And
so good.
The bizarre story is the fact that a kid who lived 2 doors down from us, as a matter of fact, my son and his son were friends. They played together. And long story made short, his father called me up one day and said, hey, I've got my son likes wrestling, and I've got tickets to this wrestling event that's at a high school in West St. Louis County. You'll tell me the rest of the story in a minute. And I want to know if it's okay if I take your son. I said, fine. So a couple days later, he calls me back and he says, Brad, he says, I got a problem. He says, I've been called out of town on business. I won't be back for that wrestling event. Is there any way you can take my son and your son to this event? As I got 3 tickets. I said, fine, no problem. Great, I'll go. So we go, and we're sitting like 3 rows from the ring. And it's the ring set up in a high school gymnasium. And the funny part of the story was, at one point, and I can't remember who the wrestler was. Do you know who it is?
I'm going to tell you in a minute.
Okay, you're going to tell me who it is. Okay, so we had the perfect angle when this high-profile wrestler, who at the time was very high-profile, took a swing at his opponent and missed by a good 6 inches, and the opponent reeled back like he just got hit by like a brick and falls on the mat. And instantly, my son and his friend, their eyes come to me like, and their mouth open like, and they both said almost instantly, he didn't even hit him. And I said to him,
and the illusion was broken. It was like watching David Copperfield, from a backstage angle.
Right. It's somebody telling you, well, let me show you how this magic trick's done. And they show you, okay, I get it. Okay, so I mentioned this, and you were like, no, hold on a minute now. Professional wrestling event at a high school. You sort of found it hard to believe, correct?
I found it, and you know what I thought? I thought, hey, the old man has lost his mind.
Well, that's true.
That is true, actually, but not in this regard. So what I did over the weekend, were you done with that portion of it, Brad?
Oh, yeah. I'm setting you up.
So what I did, listen, I was like, Brad might be misremembering a little bit. He's got some cobwebs up there.
That's no doubt about that.
So I went on a tremendous website called cagematch.net, which I have used. I don't even want to tell you how many times I've been to this website to look up results here and there. Brad was entirely accurate. And what I thought was strange about the story, I was like, look, there's no way that WCW, which was owned by Ted Turner from TBS fame, I thought there's no way they're going to be working a high school gymnasium in front of, a few hundred people. Turns out we're coming up on the anniversary on January 22nd, 1993. So 30 years ago. By the way, Brad, you got that almost exactly right. It was 31 years ago. Now, the cage match doesn't have the location. You say it was Parkway West because you remember it being on Clayton Road.
It was somewhere, I believe it was, I believe that was the high school. Because remember, I even asked you.
It doesn't have it listed here, but it has all the results. Now, crazy thing we'll get into real quickly. Brad, you saw in the main event, by the way, the wrestler you're thinking of, I know exactly who it is, and it was the wrestler named Sting.
Exactly.
It was Sting. He was the top babyface in WCW at the time. And in that match, he was fighting Big Van Vader.
And didn't Sting have long blonde hair?
He did. Yeah, he was the Sting.
I remember this.
Let me tell you something. I had a Sting T-shirt that I won on a radio trivia contest. I have pictures of it. And I won it by calling into a show called Sports Memories, if you remember. I think it was on KXOK. In 1991, I won a Sting T-shirt. Anyway, neither here nor there. But the point is, Brad, do you know who was in the main event who was not yet a superstar?
Who?
A guy named Stunning Steve. You know who Stunning Steve was?
No.
He ended up being Stone Cold Steve Austin.
Get out of here.
He was teaming with a guy. Now, let me tell you something. Growing up, I had 3 favorite wrestlers. When I was in kindergarten, elementary school, it was Hulk Hogan. Then I started watching TBS, and it was Ric Flair. Then a guy named Stunning Steve came to WCW in 1991 and was my favorite wrestler.
So you're telling me that we saw Stone Cold Steve Austin?
Yep, he was tagging with Brian Pillman, and he was up against Ricky the Dragon Steamboat and Shane Douglas. That was the main event, and it was for the World Tag Team titles. And Stunning Steve was paired with Pillman back then, and their tag team was called the Hollywood Blondes.
And that was they were that
was Stunning Steve. Yep, that was the main event of your match.
I don't believe that.
And now also, I hate to get a little bit macabre here, Brad, but let's get a little bit macabre. The second match you saw was a singles match, and it was Eric Watts, who is the son of legendary Mid-South promoter Cowboy Bill Watts. He fought a guy named Chris Benoit. Does that name ring a bell?
I remember that name as well, too.
So Chris Benoit was the guy that maybe 15, 17 years ago, something like that, killed himself and his family.
That's right.
Yeah, so Chris Benoit he wasn't the curtain jerker. He wasn't the first match, but he was the second match. And Benoit had only been in WCW, I think, for maybe like a year or two at the time. He came in, he had worked a lot in Calgary, he had worked in Japan. But this was really the start of Benoit's ascendancy in WCW. So you saw him, and there was a guy in WWF by the name of Goldust. Do you remember that name?
I don't remember that name.
Okay. Anyway, he ended up being he was controversial because he was a kind of a quasi-gay character. He was like a cross-dresser. And his real name was Dustin Runnels, or Dustin Rhodes, but he was there. But the match that you remember seeing that exposed your sons to the reality of worked professional wrestling matches, that was Sting versus Big Van Vader. And unbeknownst to you, you saw the biggest icon of the 1990s, Stone Cold Steve Austin in 1993.
That is so bizarre.
And
so when was Stone Cold Steve Austin he was like big in the 90s and 2000s, wasn't he?
He absolutely was. Now, I have an Austin story. I don't know if you want to hear it now. That has to do with him calling my house in Spanish Lake.
Oh, come on! Why did he call your house in Spanish Lake?
I wrote him a fan letter.
And he called
in 1991, and I sent it to the offices of World Championship Wrestling, Ted Turner's organization.
Right.
And one day, I came home from a sporting event. So I generally don't brag about this, but I spent no one except for 1 or 2 people listening to this know this about me, so this is a revelation. I spent many years doing martial arts, Brad.
Really?
And it was a huge part of my life. I did Taekwondo, and it was the centerpiece of my life for several years. So I think grown men should not talk about, I went to an MMA gym the other day. I'm an MMA fighter, you know that? I'm also running for office. That really rubs me the wrong way. Nobody wants to hear about your MMA
You know
experience.
what? It's almost like there are things, sometimes revelations. You just led a revelation. I just heard recently that Eric Greitens used to be a Navy SEAL. Did you know that? I never heard that before.
So did Jesse the Body Ventura
right,
other people who exaggerate their resume.
Right, yeah, exactly. Okay.
But here's the thing.
Okay, so
anyway, I happened to be at a martial arts training session one day, and I came home, and my mom says, "Hey, a guy named Stunning Steve called." You know a guy named Stunning Steve? And I said, "Oh yeah," and my voice was changing. So I was like, "Yeah, he's a world television champion in WCW." And my mom's like, "Oh, that's nice." I told him to call back that you were doing Taekwondo, and he told me that he never did martial arts, but he really wishes that he wanted to. He really wishes that he did, etc. So anyway, And I'm like, oh, did he leave a number? Is he going to call back? She said, oh yeah, I told him to call back at whatever time. So the time passed, Brad, and I'm brokenhearted. So I used to, and maybe this is a little bit of a revelation. Instead of taking showers, I used to take baths. I'm comfortable enough to admit that. So anyway, I'm in the bathtub and the phone rings. Now I don't have the phone in there. But my mom answers the phone and yells upstairs and says, John, it's Stunning Steve. So I hop out of the bathtub immediately, still lathered up, and I dry off and I run and I get the phone and I'm like, hey, Stunning Steve, how you doing? And so he was the most kind and thoughtful man. And I remember a couple of things. He had a dog who was barking, who was in the backyard, and he was shouting to maybe it was his wife at the time. He's like, hey, get Cassie back in the house. Bring her back in here. And he's just talking to me. And what I remember from it is he's like, I just wanted to tell you that I just thought it was the neatest thing that you wrote me a letter. And I appreciate everybody who comes out. I appreciate you watching us on TV. And I appreciate any time you come to the matches. And I just wanted to wish you good luck on everything you're doing. And I was just completely blown away. And I didn't tell anybody the story until I was in. I told my girlfriend, my quasi girlfriend at the time, who ended up being my girlfriend. I told her that story, and I'm like, "Listen, nobody's gonna believe this, so just don't tell anybody." And then, of course, he went on to become Stone Cold Steve Austin, and I couldn't tell people the story by then, Brad.
Holy cow!
So because here's the thing, if anybody came to me in the late 90s and said, one time Stone Cold Steve Austin called me at my house when I was in middle school. First of all, I'd call the authorities and be like, what's going on here? But secondly, I'd be like, okay, pal, sure. Steve Austin is your buddy, right?
But see, there are so many different takeaways from that. There's so many different takeaways. The fact that once again, this is a different time. You wrote a letter, okay? Who does that?
Yeah, and mailed it.
Who does that anymore, okay? You wrote a letter to it went to essentially Ted Turner's organization in Atlanta, right?
Yep, and somebody there could have just tossed it in the trash and been like, stupid kid.
Yeah, like a dumb, we get, like, oh, hey, look at this one. Look at this stupid kid.
This kid loves Steve Austin.
Right. What, is he gay or something? What's the problem with him? So
I could have got a form letter from them that said, Dear sir, thank you for writing. Here's a calendar.
You put your phone number on it.
Yeah, I wanted him to call me.
Man, this is so weird. So I saw Sting, and he was the guy that threw the punch that missed by a good 6 inches.
He missed Big Van Vader, yeah.
Right, but yet the reaction that Big Van Vader had was you thought he just got hit in the face by a sledgehammer because he, and once again, this goes to the, like make fun of wrestling, but there's tremendous athleticism involved in wrestling.
For sure. And those two guys, Big Van Vader was moved better than any big man this side of Bam Bam Bigelow.
So you know who he is too, right?
Oh, yeah. So all these guys, and most of these guys, like your opening match was Johnny B. Bad versus Scotty Flamingo. Both of those guys went on to WWE. Eric Watts ended up having a short-lived career. Benoit killed himself and his family. Too Cold Scorpio went to ECW. And, Ricky Steamboat, by the way, you probably remember that name, but he had a huge career before and after this event. He was in WWF. And he was just a legendary performer.
So what were these guys doing at a high school gym?
And you know what? So you saw a very historic moment, Brad, because the month after you went to this event,
right,
a brand new guy came in to take over the reins of World Championship Wrestling.
Right.
His name was Eric Bischoff.
I know that name.
And he's the guy that turned WCW from being a second-rate promotion to almost putting Vince McMahon out of business. You know what the very first move he did was, Eric? What he did was, Brad?
No more high schools?
You're exactly right. He literally told the company, we are no longer going touring because every time he said his famous line is, every time we go on the road, we lose money. And I looked up some of the results before and after this event. Like the biggest event the time before, they drew 3,000 people. I think it was in Chicago or Philly. If you're only drawing 3,000 people to a huge arena, so think of how much money WCW lost on this show in St. Louis. And the reason why they did some high school gyms during this period of time was because, and I looked this up, the reason why they did it was because they couldn't fill the arena, Brad.
Interesting.
On a winter day, they can only get and there were 550 people was the estimated attendance at your event.
I was going to say it was in the hundreds. It wasn't that big.
Yeah.
And
so Bischoff's first move to turn the company around, he said, every time we leave Atlanta, we lose money. So guess what we're going to do? We're going to film in Atlanta. We're going to do all of our TV here. And once we get a big enough base, then we'll go to a St. Louis, we'll go to a Philly, Chicago, Atlanta, or we'll go to New York. But we'll go to big cities, but we're not gonna keep doing Peoria and Springfield, Missouri, because we're just losing thousands of dollars every time we do that.
Boy, this has been fascinating, John. I mean,
all because we somehow one day got onto wrestling. Right. I don't know how we got onto
But
that.
the bizarre part of this story is you've done the homework on this, and you've taught me a history lesson. And once again, what's sort of funny was, I'm getting up there in years, and I don't have the memory I did, but you got to.
You knew where it was, and you knew the year. You said it was right, almost exactly 30 years ago.
Yeah, because I said my son was like 9 or 10. Which
you said he was 10, so
which would have been right
30 years ago. You're right.
Okay, we have to get out of here. That's probably one of the most fun segments we've done so far. I really enjoyed it.
I loved it.
Okay, we got to get out of here. Armstrong Getty next. It's 8 o'clock.